Welcome to Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. You probably know the Bible as a religious book. Maybe you even own one or read one. But at its core, it is a collection of ancient primary manuscripts. In this show, we will examine the Bible from the perspective of a historian to examine its historicity and manuscript strength, to see if we can uncover why the founders of the United States thought this book held value for the construction of our civic system. Our host is history professor and theologian Dr. Carl Kriesman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey, Matthew.
Hey, Carl.
What are you doing, buddy?
Man, I am getting ready to jump into another fun episode.
We are. And jumping in,
Yeah.
did I see correctly that you went to a soccer match?
I did go to a soccer match.
Now, I have to, let everybody know, I have taken you personally.
Yes, you have.
But this time you went by not by yourself. You went with...
Yeah, some school people put a plan together, and I went there with my two girls, plus the daughter of a good friend of ours.
Lovely.
We had a really nice time.
Soccer's amazing. I love watching soccer.
It's just a different thing. You've given me definitely a whole new appreciation for the game that I would not have otherwise.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad. It's got the build up, and in that game, the home team, the Orlando Pride, fell behind. So then there's the anticipation. And you said second half they put some new players in, and you felt the energy change.
Yeah, man. You see a good play, or there's like an egregious foul that was not called, and just got a whole stadium of people outraged. It's like, yeah, this feels good. What'd they do? I don't know, but I'm mad.
And then it goes in the net, and they tied not late. It was in the 70th minute or so, but they tied it up. And so then they're pressing for the win. So
yeah,
I was proud of you. I didn't know that you were going to be there. And then I got a little text from you, and I'm like, check it out. I'm proud of you, man.
Well, this is how much I know about it. Somebody scores. I'm like, yay. And then one of the girls goes, that's not the home team. That's the visitors. I'm like, well, they're wearing the wrong colors.
Yeah.
So I text you. I text Carl to go, our team is wearing pink or purple. You're like, it used to be purple. Now it's pink. I'm like, cool.
Well, no, it's still purple. It's just they have the extra bonus outfit that's peach.
And it's lady sports, so I guess have as many outfits as you want.
Actually, I wish the men's team, for some reason, I think it's an MLS rule, but anyway, I wish they would allow a third jersey, because we've needed a new jersey for a while.
There you go.
But they haven't gotten in there. So let's go ahead. Let's get rocking on this.
Yes, thing. Indeed. Well, when we last left our intrepid heroes, we were talking about the idea of canon, and again, this is against a larger backdrop of looking at the Bible as a historical document. But as far as the canon, answering the question of, well, why these books and not others? Why these 66 books? And in canon, we use it in multiple different contexts, but just to specify for us here, it's from a Greek word and a Hebrew concept as well. And as you probably already know, just kind of getting to the idea of a rule or a standard. And then, as far as text, it's a list of works from a person about a subject that is, to go internet-y here, quote, a sanctioned or accepted group or body of related works.
Right, so like the Beethoven canon, the Shakespeare canon, as we talked about last time, the Star Wars canon, what writings and things and movies are part of the canon.
A lot of stuff that's important. At a certain point, you're like, okay, great, let's put them all together.
Right.
And establish that these are it, and there's other influence stuff, but that's separate from this little collection.
To stay in the internet, many people today know the concept of fan fiction.
Right.
And so within a registered idea, so Star Wars again, or Lord of the Rings, or Game of Thrones, many fans have decided on their own that they want to do things. They tell their own stories. The actual controller of the canon are like, that's nice. Those don't count.
Right.
They're outside of the canon. No matter how much everybody may like them, they're not part of the canon because they're extraneous to the official collection of materials.
Right. And so we could look at them, you read them all you want, understanding what category that they are in, which is speculative stuff.
And so that raises then the question, who decides? Obviously, in the case of a specific person, if they're alive as the author, they decide for themselves. If they are passed on, like say someone like Tolkien, then there's his family or an organization that kind of handles it. Or in the case of Star Wars, it's owned by Disney. So Lucas is still alive, so he has a role in that, I assume. But nonetheless, there's kind of people who make the decisions whether you like it or not, and that's what's chosen. In the case of something like the Bible, then, this raises all sorts of questions, and we referenced the book and the movie The Da Vinci Code, which posited back in the early 2000s the idea that, it was concluded at the Council of Nicaea, so 325. So basically 300 years after Jesus, a group of dudes got together and it's randomly picked out of what they said in the book, at least 80 different gospels to get down to 4 and all that kind of stuff. So we were looking last time at the Old Testament, and when we closed last time, I closed it by noting that what the Christians call the Old Testament, so the Jewish writings. So for Jewish people, they have their own collection of holy writings that they believe came to them from God. But these are also important to the first followers of Jesus, because Jesus is a Jewish man. His followers were all Jewish people. And those followers saw him as a fulfillment of a promised coming Savior. It goes by a term that they use called Messiah. And it predicted and was described in these ancient writings. So then when I did that, you closed out, it was amazing. So I'm quoting you now, that what we understand as the Old Testament was not pieced together by those followers, those Christians, with a particular narrative in mind. It was established, and you meant those followers of Jesus, are simply going back to this established body of work to look for hints of and about the Savior. It was not, in other words, they were not going with any agenda in mind or trying to prove a point.
Yeah.
That was well said, I thought.
And it's certainly a different reality than this kind of idea that's out there of there's a bunch of possibilities and some committee is going to argue back and forth. And I don't trust a committee for an HOA, much less something of this import. And that wasn't the case.
Yeah. Or even more devious, that a group of people just made stuff up.
Correct.
So 300 years later, they'd heard about a dude named Jesus. They said, I know, let's write a bunch of things and we'll throw them in, and just randomly out of nowhere. And of course, in the year 2100, we wouldn't necessarily know easily that something in 300 was written in 300.
Right. But as we're going to kind of get into today, stuff kind of was made up, but there are ways where that'll prove itself out.
Correct.
And become wildly self-evident.
Right. And that's, to summarize, please keep listening, but you could stop almost at this point and say, as we look now at the New Testament, that's precisely what happened. That very early, the followers and the participants of the people who knew Jesus and then their first disciples concluded a group of writings were those writings. I, Carl, don't have to like them. I can find some of them troubling. I could think that there's some other writings that emerge, say, even 50 years later are really good. I've read some of these. They are really good. They are really useful for practice of a Christian. And I can say, well, they should be included. Doesn't matter that I feel that way. This is what they said. So I'm not asking the listeners to decide that they like the books that are in the Bible. I'm asking you to think and say, I can't take them out or discount them, because the people that were concluding the thing, they're the ones that put them in. It'd be as if you found out J.R.R. Tolkien did write a 4th volume for Lord of the Rings and then concluded later, I don't like it. So the canon was, of course, everybody should know I know Tolkien, so he really wrote 1 volume, and it was only in the 3 volumes and it was published, but just work with me here. That he concluded the 3 volumes. Well, he's the author. He gets to decide what's in the canon. And if later his son Christopher wants to publish the lost section, he can and make some money. And he's done that. He's published a ton of stuff that Tolkien wrote, but was never part of the canon. So if somebody's like, well, what happened to Glorfindel? Well, wait, how did this happen with Legolas? It's in the canon. All the other stuff is just other stuff that Tolkien himself as the author thought about and disposed of and put to the side. So that's the key thing here is we're wanting to honor those people who were closest to the work and not add or detract kind of from them. So when we left off then, that part about the Old Testament, we were in about 90 AD. There had been a gathering of Jewish scholars after the destruction of the temple, which is in 70 AD, and they were in a town called Jamnia, and they had a meeting, but they really just an ongoing meeting. It's not really a council. So that's that time period, 90 AD. That's when they concluded, and we can see by 90 AD that they're locked in on the Jewish scriptures, which matches what's in our current Old Testament. All right. So that's kind of where we're at, that first century place.
Okay, so we're in the first century, and we're going to dive into here the details of the canon as we kind of just teed up. But I'm a big context person, so just give us a little broad view of this period in time toward the end of the first century. What's happening?
Yeah. That's good. Good question. Okay. So Roman Empire is working. That goes back to Octavian at the end of the BC era. Octavian, who takes the title Augustus, which I refuse to call him. So if you're a Roman Empire expert, you can be mad at me, but he's always Octavian. So at the end of the first century, we're now into a new dynasty. It's known as the Flavian dynasty. So there's the original from Octavian, it goes to Nero. They're all related at some level in there, and it's often known as the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So from Julius Caesar, okay, there we go. 68 AD, that all ends with Nero's death, which was basically a forced assassination. And after that, a series of different generals tried to take over. If you know your Roman Republic history, it's very much like what happened the previous century. So this is like 68 AD for only about a year. They're fighting with each other. But so there's a series of generals. I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. I'm in charge. And there's murder and assassinations. At that very time in the Middle East, so around Jerusalem, is what is known as the First Jewish-Roman War, or the Great Jewish Revolt. So there's a general and an army in Palestine, in Israel area, and they're fighting against Jewish people. That general and his soldiers, looking back at Rome, are kind of like, all right, enough of this. Our guy's going to be in charge. And so they proposed, and basically, we're going to march on Rome. We're going to send some legions. We're going to send him. And he had a kind of a factor that became a benefit in the minds of some of the powerful people in Rome, and that was that he had two healthy sons. And by having two healthy sons, they thought we can avoid secession questions after, if we support this guy, he becomes the emperor, assuming he's not crazy, he's cool, then when he dies,
we won't have to revisit this transfer of power like this again.
And maybe they'll have kids and we'll all go home happy.
Yeah.
They don't have kids, but for those three, and that guy's name is Vespasian, his son is Titus and Domitian. And if you know your Jewish history, you probably may go, Titus, wait a minute, I think I know that guy. Yeah, he's the guy who stays in the Middle East with the army, or most of the army, battling against the Jewish people in that great Jewish revolt, which started in 66 AD, goes through 73. Well, Vespasian leaves, goes back to Rome. Titus stays. He's in charge. And he's the one who ultimately besieges Jerusalem, captures Jerusalem, destroys Jerusalem's walls, destroys the temple. There's some holdouts. You may have heard of a place called Masada. Basically, the last holdouts of what was known as the Zealots, who were the ones who were, most animated about battling Rome. Remember, one of Jesus' disciples was a zealot, Simon the Zealot. And so they retreated to Masada, and not Titus. He ended up going back to Rome after the great victory of Jerusalem. But the general who's left, they basically take care of Masada, and by 73 AD, everything is kind of settled. So you got a new dynasty in charge of the empire. The temple's been destroyed. Jerusalem's been destroyed. There's not really a great scattering, but there's a little bit. But in general, there's no more Israel. There's no Middle East. There really hasn't been in my reading of it. I understand there's reasons and arguments that can be made about what happens with the Maccabees, but in any case, so there's no like Jewish cultural center. There's no nation. There's no grouping as there was, at least when they came back from Persia in the 500s. There's this idea of a place that was still there, and they got to rebuild the temple and kind of a thing. A couple other things to note. In those last 3 decades of the first century is when you have some of the earliest direct persecutions to Christians in Rome, particularly under Nero, but even prior to that. So in 49 AD, according to Suetonius, Jews were expelled from Rome under Emperor Claudius. Now, what's interesting about this is that is noted by Dr. Luke in his historical writing, the Acts. If you read Acts 18, 1-2, it's noted of that. So you have both Suetonius and Luke talking about this expulsion. Obviously, in Acts, the people that are expelled were Jewish Christians. So it's not clear fully to me, but my assumption is that Claudius, like Nero after him, is really trying to target this Christian group who's being really weird about things that Christians are weird about, unwilling to worship the emperor, unwilling to give appropriate, sacrifices and this kind of a thing. But to these Romans, it's probably not clear to them that this is a distinct group. It's just that some weird sect of the Jews.
Right.
So the Jewish people, even if they weren't Christians, are getting wrapped up in this and kind of getting penalized or expelled from the area. So this plays into what's happening that becomes really apparent after the 70 AD destruction, in which Jewish Christians, which most Christians by that point were Jewish, probably 70%, I'd say, and Jewish non-Christians, so the regular Jewish people, they part ways. If you look at some of the early sources that we have, and there's not a lot, but it feels like if you look at that, in most cities, Jewish Christians were still at synagogue. We're still sometimes taking Sabbath on the Saturday or the Sabbath day, which is Saturday for us. Still participating, as long as there was a temple, in temple sacrifices to some degree. So they're participating. And then after 70 AD, there becomes a real intent within the Jewish community to get rid of these weird freaks, who these people who believe that this guy Jesus was the Messiah, which for them was a heresy, right? That Jesus was clearly not the Messiah. So they're kind of going, trying to get rid of them. So basically, you end up with more and more Christian communities in the Middle East, around at least the eastern Mediterranean coast, through North Africa, at least over towards Libya, on the northern part of the Mediterranean, so into Greece, lower Balkans, Italy. Some evidence of early communities, say by 60, in Spain, or would have been known as Hispania for the Romans. And their identity was as followers of the way, right? That's the kind of way they saw themselves. So this is that's the historical setting we have there. All right? So
Nice.
Is that good?
I like it.
Okay. So let's talk now about the canon.
Yeah.
So Matthew, I know there's 27 books in the New Testament, etc. Are those listed chronologically?
That's a great question, Carl. But no, as we've talked about, it is better thought of as a library.
Thank you.
And libraries are organized and structured, but typically not chronologically.
Very nice.
So in the span of those books, it covers what we would call 4 biographies, for lack of a better word. There's a book of history. There's a bunch of writings from Paul, and there's some other writers, and then it ends with how it all ends up in Revelation. So that is like chronologically at the end, but the rest of it is not organized chronologically.
Yeah, that's true. I guess Revelation is the last book written, and it's the last one in there. So that makes sense. So if the Bible, when I pick up a Bible and I look and I see Matthew as the very first book, you didn't write it.
I did not write it.
But a guy named Matthew.
Yes.
He's not the first writer chronologically. Do you know who is?
My guess is everybody's favorite enforcer turned apostle, Paul.
That's right.
All right.
Yeah. And you and I were talking the other day, or the last time, one of the early episodes, like, why did he get a new name?
Yeah.
Waiting for somebody to chime in with that information.
Yes.
All right, so we've mentioned him before. We've kind of walked our way through it, but let's just review this really quickly. He had been trained. He'd gone to school, like I'm a college professor. He'd gone to the right schools, gone to the best schools, was part of a group called the Pharisees. These are highly educated, highly literate, determined supporters of the Pentateuch, of the Torah writing, the law of God, and wanted it to be followed fully. He was someone who was an opponent, as you said, around 32 AD. He's converted to Christianity by his own testimony, he says, with a direct interaction with Jesus. We're not touching that, whether that's what he says. About 3 years later, we know he has a meeting with the core apostles, the core people who were followers of Jesus. That's around 35. He talked, again, a lot of this has historical markers in the Bible. I don't want to give you too much from a sense of too much information, but based on the historical evidence from Dr. Luke, we know that Paul started his missionary activity in basically in modern-day Turkey around 47 AD. Then he pushes on into Greece and eventually ends up in Italy around 60, so same time as Nero. And then there's some debate as to what happens as he stays in Rome he's there as a prisoner. Mm-hmm. Is he killed there, or there's some suggestion that he has maybe a 2 to 4 year window of freedom in which he goes to Spain and he gets rearrested. That's historically, I lean on he did not go to Spain crowd, but there are other historians who think he does. While he's traveling, he writes a series of letters, and that's the best way to look at these. They're like personal letters. One-sided letters, unfortunately, so no different than reading only if there's an email chain, or maybe for us more modern viewpoint, a text chain, but you only have the one side. Context is very tricky at times. Some of those are laid out like, you can tell he's really like answering questions, and some of them are kind of like one question at the start, and then he spends like 9 chapters kind of, what we call chapters. He didn't have chapters. And we've noted that he often quotes older material, either songs or creeds, that we're very confident about that he got very early. So we know that there's really clear creeds about what the people believe as early as, say, 33, 34, 35. So within 3 or 4 years of when Jesus was crucified and resurrected. All right. So then the Gospels come. So the Gospels are that bio. We'll talk more about those in another episode, like what that actually means. But just think of those as biographies. So the 4 biographies come, and they're in this order from a sense of chronology. So the first of those is written by a man named Mark. Perhaps his name is John Mark. And he's associated both with Paul and Peter. So with Paul, I don't think he would have gotten too much from a historical data point. But so we generally think of, when you read the Gospel of Mark, you're reading Peter's thoughts, Peter's ideas that Mark wrote down, not as a secretary necessarily, but we don't have the idea that Mark's out doing a whole bunch of examination, historical reflection on his own. Then another of Paul's companions is this guy I've mentioned, Luke, a couple times. He's a doctor, he's a physician. I am in the camp that says he is the preeminent historian of the Roman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean. So in this 1st century AD, if you want to know about what was going on, get a sense of the culture of some of the leaders, you read Dr. Luke. He has a 2-volume set, which we mentioned, but here from the Gospels, he writes that one first. He seems to have been gathering information when he's with Paul. So this is somewhere in the 50s. Mark's writing, let me go back. Mark's writing, we feel really confident, is finished between 50 and 60, probably leaning closer to early 50s, 52, 53, something like that. Luke is gathering information at that time. He's the one who describes in the opening of his book that he's doing a lot of research on it. He's got a patron, a Roman man named Theophilus, who basically is paid for him to do this. We're not sure if Theophilus is a Christian. Somebody who wants to know about the Christian thing. Perhaps when Paul is in prison there, this guy has heard Paul's speech, and he's like, hey, well, I want to know more about this. And so they're like, well, we could send Luke, go find some more information and write you up an account. So that's probably what went down. Thirdly, this is the first book that's listed, but it's the third one in order chronologically, at least the way I see it, is another one of the apostles. His name is Matthew. He was still living in the Middle East, though at some point he's going to end up going down the Nile, so over into Egypt arena. So somewhere in about 58 to 65, which is roughly the same time Luke's publishing. They wouldn't have used that term. Right. Luke finishes, gives his to Theophilus. So imagine Luke's in Rome, meeting Theophilus. Here you go. And he reads it. I'm sure Paul would have read it, would have thought and given any offers of thoughts that he had. Meanwhile, all the way across in either Antioch or maybe down near Alexandria or somewhere on the Nile, Matthew's doing the same thing. And he composes his own collection of information about the life of Jesus. I mean, clearly some of these guys, probably Mark also, may have talked to other people. Remind me what you went through. But again, Mark, we think of that being Peter's, the lead, like, historical evidence, so first person evidence for Mark. Luke collecting from lots of people. with Paul's leaning, perhaps. And then Matthew on his own, obviously having been there, reflecting a lot. So then after that, at least a decade later, some would argue 3 decades later, the last gospel is written by another one of Jesus' apostles, a man named John. So you have 2 by apostles directly, John and Matthew, 1 by an apostle indirectly, Mark, connected to Peter. Okay. And then Luke and Paul, it's a whole different story about what the word apostle. When I say apostle, I mean he's somebody who actually was there with Jesus when Jesus was alive. Okay. John probably wrote this when he was in exile on Patmos. He got in trouble. Well, really, it was just a reflection of what was going on in Rome. A lot of people were exiled to the island of Patmos. But he also had been living in Ephesus. He will die in Ephesus after the exile ends, after there's a new emperor. Those prisoners are all released. And so he writes it somewhere in there. It's at least early 90s, which would make him very old himself. Everybody thinking, wait, how old would he be? So mostly people think he's the youngest of the apostles, of the disciples. So if he's 20 in 30 AD when Jesus dies, then in 90, he himself is, in that ballpark of 80, 90 years old in that process. But there's some evidence that you could say this was written mid-70s. Remember, this is the one, when we talked about manuscript evidence, we have one of our, in fact, I would say the earliest manuscript. It's a fragment, it's very small, but it's clearly from John. It's dated to somewhere between 98 and 138 AD. So if it's a copy, that means it had to have been copied from somewhere. It means it's been on the move. So its original was earlier than that. But the evidence seems pretty clear. Some other evidence we're going to get to, 90s. I would usually stick it in the very early 90s, but there's some others who would stick it in the 70s. And by the way, before I ask you if you're good, I'll add that on all these things, when there's dates, there's a scholarly debate, and you can find other scholars, perhaps many more famous and credentialed than myself, who would disagree, who would offer other dates. But on the main, what I've just given you is the majority consensus.
Yeah. Nice. And at various points throughout the scriptures, specific historical events are mentioned. So it's this nice little way of pegging. It's like, well, it must have been written after this period or that period.
Correct.
And you're like, thank you for mentioning that. It's helpful.
And then, as you said, the rest of the letters, so there's other writers, and then the final book by John, those all come somewhere roughly 70 to 90. Okay. So at this point, we could say, back to where we started the podcast, it's 90 AD. There's Jewish scholars in Jamnia. So 90 AD, is there a list that's written somewhere to say, ta-da, the canon of the New Testament? And there is not. There's no list at this point. I think some of that is because the people are still alive and the small groups are kind of still meeting. So in other words, your church could sort of randomly have a visit by an apostle, by one of the disciples.
Right.
And then, of course, they're going to tell you their own stories. They're going to tell you things. They're going to tell you some of the teachings. They weren't as needing to lean on, let's open our Bibles to so-and-so book and read this thing from such and such. So by the time you get to 100, though, everybody's dead, including John. John's the last one to die, who is a first-person participant. Now, they all have disciples. That's that group we've mentioned before called the church fathers. But it's very clear from the evidence, we're going to go through some of this, that throughout the Christian communities, throughout the Mediterranean world, they all had the 4 biographies. They all had Dr. Luke's Acts. They had all kind of confirmed the sense of these historical reports through these 5 documents. And they had various writings of the other books, right? So there's 27 books in the New Testament, so 27 minus 5 is 22. So of the 22 other things written, if you'd gone to a church in X location in Greece and then gone across the Mediterranean to Alexandria, you might have found a different collection of those other letters, mostly just because they might not have had a chance to get another copy. They hadn't necessarily heard that there was this letter written. So it's still very early in the historical journey of these groups. There's I think I said this to you before. One scholar said that if you look at the Christian community at this point, it's very loose around the edges. Its core is central, right? Its core is set. Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah. Jesus lived as a human, died, resurrected. And then from that, there's a lot of questions that are being answered as we go along. But this general sense of Jesus as Messiah coming to offer us this pathway back to a wholeness related to God, and it's open for everybody. This is the central message of that's the good news that they're offering. And so they have that information. But at this point, once you shift over in that 100 is when you start getting these other writings that begin to occur, because the disciples of the disciples are themselves writing information down, right? So one of the first ones is a writing. It's not got an author that we know of, called the Didache. And it's like a series of teachings about the core idea of Christianity, like I just told you. And the latter part of it is like, how are churches supposed to operate? Like, what are they supposed to do in certain places? And so you start running through, and I'm going to run through a list here of a variety of people who are telling us this idea of these documents. They help us kind of get this central concept that these existed before any councils, right? So 96 AD, you've got a man named Clement. He lives in Rome. He writes a core letter about the faith, and in the letter, he quotes from 7 of the 27 books. 115 AD, another leader named Polycarp. He had collected 17 of the current writings. He quotes from them, and he's the first one to use the phrase or term we in English called scripture, but he's basically saying he's using the same phrase that as a Jewish person they would have said about the original Jewish writing. So he's equating these as a kind of given from God directive information for us. So 115. 125, a man named Barnabas, who happens to live in Alexandria. He quotes from various parts of the New Testament. Then in 150, another man named Justin Martyr. He quotes from all 4 Gospels, several of Paul's letters, and the Revelation in his apologetic works. He's kind of defending the faith in Rome and explaining again. And again, just make sure it's clear. If something's quoted, that means it existed beforehand. Yeah. It's not just, when I say that they're mentioning them or they're quoting them, I'm not saying they just sort of reference some phrases in Greek that some scholars like, well, that's sort of like this verse over here. No, we're talking about direct quotations that you can trace back to specific spots in the Gospels and these writings. So they're quoting from them. So that's important. But at this part in our journey, so 150 AD, there's still no official list of what is, the right books to have included.
Okay. So by this time, mid first century, mid second century, essentially the writings that we know to be the New Testament have been written.
Yes.
But like you just said, nobody has stopped and thrown a lasso around them to say, this is it, these only, no others, for the reasons you had already mentioned. Now, I had read something about someone who took a stab at saying, no, this is the official list, but that kind of just cratered. What was that story?
So his name is Marcion.
Okay.
So he, by his own words, he's a Christian. So he's somebody in the Christian community. And he is someone who believes very deeply that Paul has given us the best description and picture of the Christian faith. Now, so let's say around 140, 150. So we're now 110 years since Jesus, right? So clearly we can understand someone in that setting kind of going, all I know are the things I'm being taught. And from what I'm being taught, I think this sounds right to me. Okay. So he created a list of what he believes should be the official canon. And it was 10 of Paul's letters. I think 10 because those are the 10 he knew, but 10 of Paul's letter and the one gospel associated with Paul, Luke. And that's it. And that's the canon. That's what the Holy Scripture. I think he probably thought of Acts as kind of a nice history book, but not anything that's inspired. So it gives us information, but nothing we need.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the ones he put forward were eventually, there was nothing that he put forward that was not eventually in.
Correct.
where he was short is
He excluded everything
excluding
else.
other things, which is way different than, hey, these 35 should be in
Correct.
there.
Correct.
That's
Yes.
that's a very important aspect.
Yes. And at this point in 150, there's at least one quote unquote other gospel that we know of, which we're going to get to hopefully this episode, maybe next episode. We'll see. So what he thought is that all the other followers of Jesus, except for Paul, had either never actually rejected their Judaism or had slipped back into Judaism. Now, there's a whole theological conversation here, which we don't really have time to get too deep into. But when you read both the history and the Bible about what's going on, there's a growing question of, if someone is not Jewish, do they need to start doing the Jewish things that Jewish people had done? When Jesus was alive, he did all the Jewish things that Jewish people did relative to their worship of the one true God. And then later, and you see this really described in Acts, which is probably another reason why he didn't want to include Acts. You get this picture of the disciples themselves confronting, we've got all these people who aren't Jewish. What are we going to do? Are we going to make them come in? And the conclusion was no. And so there wasn't. And that, I think they thought, was matched by different things Jesus himself had said. Again, it's a longer conversation, but it's getting into this idea of like, can we be Christians? Do we have to do Jewish things or not? And Marcion thought, when he read some of the other letters and when he read Matthew, Mark, and John's Gospels, they were terrible. They had gone back to Judaism. Now, I don't know why he thought that. I'd love to have a conversation with Marcion, just sort of say, help me understand this a little bit better. Because when I read them, I don't see the things he's concerned with. But nonetheless, that's kind of his position. And he tried to get support, ultimately was rejected in all the places he tried, including Rome. And once he's rejected, he finally says, well, I'm taking my marbles and going away. But the key for you and me is that then, to some degree, as it relates to canon, sort of a line had been drawn in the sand of saying, these are the correct writings.
Yeah, right. Even when he came up with the wrong answer, it does kind of open up the conversation of like, he's off base, but now that he's brought it up, we really should tack this down.
And you are, again, as I'm said, you are getting other writings now. Now we're 130, 140 years after Jesus. You are starting to get other writings that will, in the titles, will specifically say Gospel of blankety blank. Some are other letters. And as we're going to see in a minute, you've got letters from some of these disciples, like the Didache or writings of Justin Martyr, that are wonderful. It'd be like you and me talking about, there's a Christian author, he's passed away now, called C.S. Lewis, and saying, hey, this writings from this guy, C.S. Lewis, this is amazing. This is, I feel like, really insightful to help me walk in my Christian faith. So it's very good. And then the question goes, well, should it be part of the canon? Well, again, now people say, well, he wrote that in the 1940s, so no. But what about, Justin Martyr writing in the 150s? What about the Didache coming at possibly 90 AD, the same time that John is writing Revelation? You can't use chronology at that point to say this is the reason. So it begins to come into minds of a lot of the Christian leaders like, yeah, we need to kind of have this discussion. And in fact, you start seeing things, some of them written directly opposing Marcion. So saying, okay, you said this, but hang on. And what they're saying is, you have rejected what we all clearly know to be previously, quote unquote, on the list. There's not a list, but we know what's in. Like nobody, You're not finding churches in 70 and 60 AD that have 7 gospels, and some that have 2 gospels, but their gospel's not the named 4 that we already given you. Bunch of writings from some other people that nobody's ever heard of. There's a consistency in kind of what they've got. So, for instance, in 170, there was a man named Tatian, and he was a student of Justin Martyr. So he put all 4 Gospels together into a harmony volume. It's called the Diatessaron, and it means through the 4. You can actually buy, not that, but you can buy similar like if you go to a Christian bookstore, look it up on Amazon, you can find kind of a harmony of the Gospels. So he put this together. The point is not whether he did a good job or that, but that he didn't put the harmony of 6 Gospels. He didn't do the harmony of 2 Gospels. He did the harmony of the 4 Gospels. In 180, Irenaeus, who was at that time in Lyon, wrote Against Heresies. And it's really responding to Marcion at this point. And he basically writes and says, okay, look, here's the list of what we're all using. And he has 23 of the current 27 volumes. He didn't have Philemon, 2 Peter, 3 John, or Jude. He talked a lot about how the whole understanding of the story hangs on the 4 Gospels, and he includes John as an eyewitness account. Irenaeus, interestingly, was a disciple of Polycarp, and he knew that Polycarp had said that he had been a disciple of John. So you get this idea of there's this linkage back that people are very clear. And think about your own grandparents. They can tell you of stories of first-person interactions that they had.
Yeah.
And so that's very helpful in realizing our historical knowledge of firsthand account can go back actually a long way. Because your grandparents may remember conversations that they had with their grandparents, and then your grandparents would be very strongly defending, no, grandpa said this about his grandpa. So now you could be back 150 years or so of getting a first-person account of something. And so that's kind of what Irenaeus is doing with Polycarp. Let's keep going. So we've now recently discovered a collection of the writings found in Milan. It's known as the Muratorian Canon. It's named after the guy who found it. But it lists 22 books. Okay, well, technically it lists 20 books, but we can see that it's torn in the part where it starts for us. It says, and the 3rd Gospel is, so we know it had a 1st and 2nd Gospel, and the 3rd Gospel is Luke. It feels good to most scholars to assume they had Matthew, Mark. So the original, this is again 190 AD. Clement, this guy now, another guy in Alexandria, he wrote commentaries on 22 Gospels, or 22 of the 27 books, not the same 22 actually. Tertullian, who's living from 160 to 220, he writes on and quotes from 24 of the books. He also did not include Philemon, 2 Peter, 3 John. He also wrote specifically a long treatise aimed at sort of against Marcion. And then Clement, another Clement, different Clement. He quotes from all New Testament writings except Philemon, James, 2 Peter, and 2 and 3 John. Origen in 230, he actually created a formal list. He had a list of 21. He noted that there were the 6 other books. He said, I like them. It's not that these aren't included on the list. It's just these 6 are in dispute. Different churches or leaders think differently about them. And then lastly, Eusebius of Caesarea in 324, which is the year before Nicaea. He created a list, again, 22 universally accepted books. He said, hey, there's these 5. I think these 5 are good, but some of them are in dispute. This time the 5 was James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John. Remember also, we've talked about before, in 303, Emperor Diocletian ordered the destruction of Christian sacred writings at that part. That can only mean that they existed, that there was a clear sense of these are the sacred or holy writings. So the emperor wouldn't have done this if it was just like, hey, give me everything any Christian has ever written, because that's silly. You're going to go out of your way to try to narrow down. Like, we know there's a list. We know these books are held in high esteem in these different cult groups called Christians. Go get those books. We want to burn those suckers. So they're doing that. So that gets us all to the time of Nicaea. Now, I said last episode, when you look at Nicaea, there actually isn't a moment in that meeting, regardless of what Dan Brown wrote, where they actually talked about the canon. So that's not even on their agenda. They have some other things that are really important that they deal with. But so that doesn't even happen. So just we're all the way to 325. And so finally, coming out of in the 4th century, you've got one more important person, Athanasius of Alexandria. He is the first person to comprise the list and say, this is the 27. So in other words, we're kind of past the point where there's dispute about 4 or 5 of the smaller books. By 367 AD, everybody's on board. These are them, right? And then at the same time, both Jerome and Augustine, they have their own list. So you have these three leaders, Athanasius, Jerome, Augustine, who all three are saying, here's the list of the holy writings. All that finally leads into 393, there's a council at Hippo, 397, the Synod of Carthage, and then later in 419, there's another council in Carthage. This is the first time that you can find a council that says, ta-da, we as the collected leaders who are in the room right now officially affirm this idea of these are the holy writings. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It's cool that over time it kind of became self-evident what is real and belongs, even though there's a couple that took a little bit of further discussion. What are some of, briefly, like one of the things that they're looking for? What are some of the hallmarks of this has it, this doesn't, whatever that it is?
Okay. I'm going to give you a quick overview.
Yeah.
And then I think that's probably a good stopping spot.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave people hanging.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to go in depth on those in the next episode. So 4 key criteria.
Okay.
Is there an association with one of the actual apostles with Jesus? 2, is what's written there, does it conform to the kind of the orthodoxy, or we might say the rule of faith, to the Christian tradition? Does it match what we know?
It's congruent, yeah.
Yep. Is it used? 3, has this writing been used worldwide? When I say worldwide, I mean amongst the Christian communities that existed in the first century. And then 4, does the writing itself give any evidence of the power and presence of God, so sort of self-authenticating? All right? So what we can see is by the time we get to a council saying this is the list, they're merely reflecting what had been building for now basically 350, 360 years. And as you said, as we started off the episode, as a reminder from last episode, they're only reflecting what's already known.
Mm-hmm.
They're not attempting to create. There's some discussion about some of the writings, some places where some of the churches, we'll come back to this listing here. We'll go in depth next episode. But in general, they're saying, yep, this is what has been kind of handed down authoritatively through these first centuries, starting from the very first followers. And that's what we can then affirm as the canon.
Getting good.
Yeah. All right. See you next time.
See ya.
Thanks for joining us on Uncovered, the Bible as Historical Document. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or a reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports this show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/uncovered.